everyone, welcome to another quick tip video for SimonsStamp.com. Today I'm going to be talking about embossing and the different types of embossing. There are two types. There's heat embossing or dry embossing, and I'm just going to walk you through the basics of each. So what makes embossing is if you have either a raised or a depressed image in a piece of paper. And one of the ways you can get a raised or depressed edge is by using dry embossing. And the easiest way to do that is to use an embossing folder. These have been, recent to the crafting world within the last 5 years or so. They didn't really have much like this before then. They did have some like single-sided texture plates, things like that. I know Sizzix had some. But since they started making these folders, it's made embossing and dry embossing in particular so much easier and faster. So I'm going to show you how to do that with a Sizzix Big Shot machine, but most die cutting machines will take these dry embossing folders with no problem. Alright, I have my Big Shot here, and I'm using the multi-purpose platform. It's the older version, so I'm going to open it up to just the one tab, and I'll start to put that through. Have my embossing folder and my piece of cardstock. I'm just going to slide that in, fold that, and I'm going to put down cutting plates, and then my folder, and then another cutting plate. And then I'm going to go ahead and roll this through my machine. Alright, and then when it comes out the other side, you have an embossed image. And those folders give you a really nice embossed image. You can use both sides. This is some Hero Arts layering paper, so you can use either side. You can also take a sanding block, like a Tim Holtz sanding block, and sand off the edge. And since this paper has, two colors, the white will come through on this side. So it's kind of a really cool idea for how to get some texture and some embossing on your project. The other type of embossing I'm going to talk about is heat embossing. And heat embossing is when you melt a powder that is raised off the surface of your cardstock. So it's a really great way to get opaque white on a dark piece of cardstock, or you can do silver for some more fancy embossing. I'm going to show you how to do that right now. The first thing I like to do is I like to prep my cardstock. The powder we're going to be applying really sticks to anything that's on the cardstock. So if you have any sort of other stamping or inking, or if it's a little bit moist, anything like that, even static cling can make the powder stick to areas where you don't want it. So I like to use the EK Success powder tool, and it's basically just a powder inside this little container. It has a little brush on top. And this just puts a really fine powder over the surface of the cardstock. The powder doesn't show very much. In fact, I haven't really ever seen it when I've been working with it, but it does have like a baby powder smell, so you're going to know it's working. And if you don't have a powder tool like this, if you're in a pinch, you can use a fabric dryer sheet, like one that you would put in your dryer when you're drying your clothes, to cut down on static cling. It'll do the same thing for your paper. You just rub the dryer sheet over your paper and it'll cut down on static cling. Powder tool is a little bit more convenient because it's not going to dry out, and you don't have to worry about anything going on with it, especially since these are made specifically for paper crafting. So having a powder tool is always a really great idea. So I've prepped my cardstock. Now I'm going to get my stamp ready. I'm using Versamark ink. Versamark ink dries very slowly, and it's a really sticky ink. So you want to make sure that you have an ink that's going to allow the embossing powder to really stick to your stamped image. Versamark's great for that. You can also use a pigment ink or anything like that. I like to use Versamark because it's essentially a clear ink, so if I'm going to be using clear embossing powder, I don't have to deal with any of the color coming through. So I'm going to go ahead and ink up my stamp here. This is just a stamp on my compact stamp press from Fiskars. And then I'm going to stamp this bird on the cardstock. Alright, you can't see it too much right now because, like I said before, the ink is clear, but I can see it a little bit in person. It's just a little like a little shade of the stamped image. And now I'm going to apply some embossing powder. Embossing powder generally comes in small containers like this. This is some superfine detail silver from Ranger. I generally take these out of their containers and put them in these plastic little boxes, made for your kitchen. I do this for a couple of reasons. The first is that I can keep the powder all in one area, and even with a plastic spoon so that I can scoop the embossing powder. And then I have a more precise way of sprinkling on that powder over the stamped image. You can also use the spoon for tapping. And the wide area of the box makes it so I can just shake off the excess into that same embossing powder. It prevents me from mixing embossing powder colors or having a big huge mess all over my work surface. So I keep these in plastic containers, and then I just use a marker and write the type of embossing powder on top. I don't know if you can see it, but I also write it on the side right here so that I can have them stacked in my crafting area and I can see what color they are from the side. So I'm going to put that aside here, and I'm going to use a heat tool. Now this is just an older heat tool that I have. I'm actually upgrading to the Hero Arts heat tool, which I've heard is amazing. But this is just a cheapy old one that I bought. And I'm going to get it going, and I'm going to melt the embossing powder. And the way you're going to make sure that it's melted is if you have a good light good light in your area, you can kind of move it around, and you'll notice that the surface of the embossing powder becomes shiny and kind of liquidy. You can actually see the powder melt. So I'm going to actually zoom in on this so you guys could see. Right, so you can see that white powder there, and I'll show you how it melts. Alright, I like to always hit the opposite side of the paper too. I've just noticed that the heat can sometimes warp the cardstock, and if you heat the underside of the paper too, sometimes that cuts down on any warping. So you can see that that has a little bit of a shiny surface now, and it's all melted. The white also appears more bold and a little bit sharper. So that's how you do heat embossing. And you'll notice that it's sort of raised a little bit off the surface of the paper. So here is the difference between the two. You can see there's the dry embossing, and then there's some heat embossing. Heat embossing is great if you want to get a really stark color over the top of something. It's a fun way to do it. You can also use heat embossing for some of the outlined images that you can buy. Any stamped outline images, you can emboss it, and then you have more of a guideline for when you're coloring, and it just kind of gives a little bit of a barrier. Hope that helped you guys out, and hope you try out some embossing. I'll talk to you guys later, and thanks for watching.